Welcome, everyone. Thank you for your interest and thank you for joining. I am excited to share insights into my ongoing research and the wider debate in political science about affective polarization, which refers to the dislike of political outgroups and has recently become more popular amongst political scientists. In the next 15 minutes, I will introduce you to the phenomenon and to its prevalence, and I will try to convince you that it has detrimental consequences that we should care about. So we all know the examples of political contests that are personal, that dehumanize the political opponent, and that go beyond mere disagreement. This phenomenon is at least partly captured by the term affective polarization. When we talk about polarization in general, we usually think of ideological polarization, which refers to political attitudes and opinions. But I want to focus on the other aspect of polarization, that is political affect, meaning the feelings towards other political actors. In short, this captures the dislike of political opponents and not just the usual disagreement with them. For example, this can show in the demands to imprison elected politicians without a trial, such as the images on the slide illustrate for both the United States and Germany. So I have given a first glimpse into the topic of affective polarization. In the remainder of the talk, I will first explain what affective polarization is and how we can measure it. Afterwards, I will talk about international context and how the phenomenon has developed in different countries. And I will then discuss factors associated with affective polarization, both on the country level and then zoom into individual level factors contributing to affective polarization. And finally, I will give an overview of the consequences of affective polarization that we know about today. To start off, I want to briefly introduce the concept of affective polarization and explain how we measure it. In contrast to political opinions, we are here talking about feelings towards political actors, in particular parties. This is important because quite fundamentally, there might be a reason to disagree, even strongly disagree with a party's political position, for example, on the environment or on taxation. And we need that in a democracy. If all parties and all people have the same opinions, then elections, for example, don't really work. But hating a party happens, for example, more for who they are and not for what they want. And that is a crucial distinction because the position could change. So we might at some point in the future disagree with the party with which we agree today. But dislike is less flexible. If we despise a party for who they are, this is unlikely to change, even if their positions are different tomorrow. We measure affective polarization by asking respondents the question you see on the slide, how much they like a party on a scale from 0 to 100. And it is important here to highlight that people give a different response to this question than they do to questions about agreeing with a party. So we are measuring something different here indeed. To illustrate how we get from the answer to this question to affective polarization in an entire country, let's focus on the United States. The United States not only makes us think of fierce political competition, but it also has effectively a two-party system, which is very convenient since it makes affective polarization more straightforward to explain. The data you see here are the average respondents of people that identify as Democrats and that rated the Democratic Party on the scale that you saw before. So these are the in-party ratings of Democrats. Now, the same respondents were also asked how much they like the other party, the out party, the Republicans. Their responses are the lower line, and we see that these ratings are not only lower, but they also decrease over time. Now, to measure how affective polarization changes, we subtract these two values. This is the red line you see. This has a low starting value that increases, and that is the difference between how Democrats like their own party and how much they like the other party. And that is the value for the affective polarization that is evoked by the Republican Party. Now, we can also do the same thing for Republicans. The line on top is supporters of the Republican Party rating their own party. The line that starts in the middle is the rating of Republican supporters of the out party, the Democrats. And the blue line you see, again with a low starting value that increases over time, that is the difference between how much Republican supporters like their own party and how much they like the out party. And that is the level of affective polarization that is evoked by the Democratic Party. Now, to get a countrywide measure, we only focus on these measures of affective polarization, so these difference measures. In essence, we need to find a way to measure how much the country as a whole is polarized. And to do this, we calculate the weighted average. And we weigh the affective polarization towards the Republican Party by the percentage of votes that the Republican Party got in the parliamentary election in that year. And we do the same for the Democratic Party. The result is the black line in the middle that shows us the affective polarization index for the United States over time. This index has the advantage that it also works for multi-party systems, and thereby it is comparable across countries. So now we know how affective polarization is measured in a country, and we know how polarized the United States are. We have talked about the United States now because this is a straightforward example. In fact, political science research on the phenomenon has also only in the last couple of years started looking at multi-party contexts beyond the United States. But this leads us to ask, how do the United States fare in international comparison? This is the result from one of the first comparative studies from about affective polarization, and it shows values of affective polarization in different countries. The results show that the US are by no means the only country that exhibits polarization in affect. By contrast, the US are somewhere in the midfield internationally. Now, of course, this is only a glimpse at one point in time, but how has affective polarization developed over time? We can again calculate these indices for affective polarization for multiple countries over time. This is visualized in this figure, where each line represents one country and the United States are highlighted. A comparison reveals that the US is not an outlier over time either. When we calculate the average, it becomes even clearer that the US are on the one hand above average, and on the other hand, affective polarization is increasing more strongly in the US than it is on average in other countries. But importantly, the US is not an outlier, and affective polarization is a widespread phenomenon indeed. Now we have talked about the levels of affective polarization, and we have seen that it is intensifying in many Western democracies. But this begs the questions about the causes of affective polarization. Now, we can identify 3 factors that we can measure on the country level, which are connected to affective polarization. However, we need to be careful with our language here because we do not know yet if these factors cause affective polarization or if there is something else causing, for example, both of these factors and affective polarization. So we should speak of associations here instead of causes for now. But we do know that 3 phenomena are more pronounced in countries that also exhibit stronger affective polarization. The first of these factors is ideological. Countries in which ideological polarization is stronger are also more effectively polarized. This is especially true for countries where political positions on cultural issues are more polarized. Cultural issues include immigration, the environment, women's rights, minority rights, and so on. The second set of factors is economic. Countries with higher income inequality and countries with higher unemployment also exhibit higher levels of affective polarization. And finally, some political institutions are associated with higher affective polarization. The way votes are translated into parliament seats matters for outgroup hate. Countries with proportional electoral systems have lower levels of affective polarization than countries with majoritarian electoral systems. So a country where the percentage that a party received in the elections matches more closely their share of seats in the parliament, on average, shows lower levels of affective polarization. So these are the 3 factors that are associated with affective polarization on the level of countries: ideological polarization, inequality, and election system. But what happens more specifically on the individual level? What might drive individuals to dislike some parties more than others? This is an analysis based on surveys in different countries, where we focus on 3 different factors of further dividing up political competition of out parties, first into a left and a right camp, then along a left-right axis, and then distinguishing between far-right parties and non-far-right parties. We analyze how much each demarcation between different groups contributes to affective polarization. The first bar at the bottom in dark blue indicates the share of outgroup affect that is associated with dislike towards a party from the other camp. This shows that people don't just dislike out parties, they dislike out parties from the other camp more. The second, brighter blue bar refers to the distance on a left-right spectrum. This indicates that people dislike out parties that are ideologically further away. And the third factor is a divide between the far right and other parties. The bar shows that there is quite some dislike between the far right and its supporters and the other political parties. If we look at the averages of these factors in the different countries at the right side of the horizontal axis, then we see that each of these factors contributes varying shares, and also that a large portion is unexplained, which you see at the top. We can, however, also see that overall, around 20% of affective polarization are associated with political camps, around 25% with left-right distance, and around 20% with a divide between the far right and the other parties. Okay, we have now seen that affective polarization is increasing internationally and is associated with different distinctions between political groups. But what are the consequences of this? I will discuss this in the last part of the presentation and focus on the consequences of affective polarization. These consequences in the political domain are not established that well yet, so I will here illustrate 3 consequences in daily life outside of the political context. These findings are very much rooted in the US context, where most research on the consequences of affective polarization has been done thus far. First, affective polarization leads to political considerations influencing non-political decisions, such as finding a spouse or finding a roommate. So people prefer to live with and marry someone who identifies with the same party, which contributes to more ideologically homogeneous private networks. Second, affective polarization can decrease outgroup trust, which is the trust towards people from another group, here, supporters of another party. So all else being equal, Democrats trust Republicans less. And finally, because of negative outgroup affect, supporters of the other political party are discriminated against and members of the own party are preferred. So to sum up, I have shown that affective polarization is what it is, and I have argued that it is increasingly prevalent internationally, both in the US and beyond. I have also discussed factors that are associated with affective polarization, both on the country level and on the individual level. And finally, I have shown some of the consequences that this political phenomenon has on daily life. Together, I hope I have convinced you that this is an important phenomenon that can endanger democracy and that we should care about. That's it. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.